I would like to welcome all participants and all listeners who are still joining us coming into the room. Um, Welcome on this in St. Louis pretty dreary Saturday morning to a panel discussion about African American architecture in St. Louis, discussing the practice of Charles Fleming. My name is Sabine Eckman, and I'm the Chief Curator and Director of the Kemper Art Museum. This program is co-sponsored and co-organized between the College of Architecture, the School of Architecture in the Sam Fox School at Washington University, and the Kemper Art Museum. It's my pleasure to briefly introduce the participants of this morning's program without taking too much time, I hope. I would like to start with our distinguished guest, Charles Fleming, who was born in 1937. He was the first African American to study architecture at what is today called the Sam Fox School at Washington University. He designed many suburban houses in St. Louis County, including on Bennett Avenue in Richmond Heights, one of the few suburban streets open to Black buyers in the 1950s and 60s. Fleming worked for the architecture firm HOK before going into partnership with Kerry Jenkins, a California-based architect, also originally from St. Louis. Their firm, that was founded in 1968, Jenkins Fleming, developed a national practice and designed the physician's dormitory at the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. General Community Hospital in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles. Fleming was appointed St. Louis City Housing Commissioner by Mayor Alfonso Cervantes, and Jenkins Fleming was involved in efforts to redesign the troubled Pruitt Igoe public housing project before its demolition in 1976. The firm also designed and oversaw the project management of many health facilities and school renovations in disadvantaged neighborhoods nationally, including in St. Louis, the Comprehensive Care Center in North St. Louis, and they collaborated on such transportation infrastructure projects as the Art Center MARTA Station in Atlanta in 1978. In 1979, Fleming founded Fleming Corporation, which continued to do many national and local projects into the 1990s. And our second guest is Michael Willis, also an alum of the Sam Fox School. He earned both his undergraduate degree and a joint master's degree in architecture and social work at Washington University. After spending 10 years with the Fleming Corporation in St. Louis, in 1988, he launched Michael Willis Architects, MWA, in San Francisco. MWA has created master plans and designs for several mixed income affordable housing projects in neighborhood revitalization projects in San Francisco, Oakland, Portland, Detroit, St. Louis, Memphis, in post-Katrina New Orleans. He has served as principal on large projects, including the new international terminal at San Francisco Airport, the Central Subway, Yerba Buena Moscona Station at the in San Francisco, and also was involved and built and designed major industrial, healthcare, and educational facilities nationally. Willis was awarded with the Distinguished Alumni Award and has been a member of the Washington University School of Architecture National Council. And to mention that at the very end, he's also a distinguished member of the Kemper Art Museum's Art Collection Committee, for which I am very grateful. Both will be in conversation today with Shantel Blakely, PhD. She's an assistant professor of architecture in the Stanford School of Design and Visual Arts here at Washington University. She's an architectural historian with additional experience in architectural practice and also in philosophy. And she is working together with Eric Mumford, PhD, the Rebecca and John Boyles Professor of Architecture and Urban Design in the Stanford School, where he also holds an appointment in the Department of History and of Art History and Archaeology. Both are working on a book about Charles Fleming that is to be published with MIT Press. Eric Mumford is currently also curator at the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum and is working on the exhibition Utopian Visions, Modern Art, Architecture and Social Change in St. Louis, 1940 to 1974. This exhibition is scheduled to open in the fall of 2024. So thank you all for joining me today. And I'm very much looking forward to the program. Eric and Shantel, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Sabina, and very deep thanks to Charles and to Michael for agreeing to do this today. I think it's an important, historically, but I think it's also obviously has a lot of contemporary relevance as well. So I'm very happy to be part of this. I thought I'd just start briefly before Shantel kind of takes over by talking a little bit about how this came to start, which really all had to do with Michael Willis, who's been very involved with the school for many years through the National Council and made all kinds of efforts really to connect the school better to St. Louis and to other important issues nationally. We were talking a few years ago at O'Connell's, and Michael was telling me that the chandeliers there came from Gaslight Square, which I didn't know that. I thought it was kind of an interesting local piece of information. And this started a conversation about how did Michael decide to become an architect. And so what he told me was that he saw this building in North St. Louis, still exists, fortunately, that had been designed by Charles Fleming. And that then started a whole series of conversations about Charles and about, I learned he was still alive, that he lived in a house he had designed in the early 70s. And then eventually I went out there and started interviewing him. And the house is, I would say, really extraordinary. And then Shantel started teaching here about a year or two ago and got involved in the whole project. So it's kind of snowballed from all that. And I think it's really been a great experience just to learn, not just about Charles, which you'll hear a lot about today, but also about this whole era in St. Louis history, which I think Shantel will be talking more about. So I'll now turn it over to Shantel, and then later on we'll have kind of a back and forth conversation.
Thank you, Eric. And thank you, Sabina, for your kind introduction. It's great to be here. And I really got interested in this project just out of curiosity. But the more I started to sort of poke into it, I've started to see more and more themes that are really important about architecture and the history of architecture, as well as about the history of Black Americans. Eric, could we have the slide?
Yeah, yeah, hold on.
Is it up?
It's up on my screen, but wait a minute, maybe, yeah, hold on.
So I'd like to start with a slide of an article that appeared in Ebony magazine. And the title of the article is Watts Gets Its Own Hospital. And the article describes how in the wake of the riots in Watts in Los Angeles, finally, like this underserved area has this new hospital. And it was designed by 3 firms, one of which was Jenkins Fleming. And it's, you may recognize it in a kind of brutalist style. It's large and ample, and it's big news because, and the article actually has several pages that show nurses and doctors and like African-American doctors and nurses caring for people. So it's clearly an important event, important enough that Ebony featured it in this issue that was also talking about the Jackson Five and athletics and some more ordinary themes. So and Jenkins Fleming didn't design this building you're seeing, but they designed a dormitory, which is actually still standing. So
we were part of the team that designed the hospital also.
Oh, you really? So you also worked on the hospital building?
Yeah, the dormitory was a project that was a Jenkins Fleming project.
That was all your own. Okay.
Right. Another thing, since I'm cutting in here.
Yeah, go ahead.
About Martin Luther King Hospital, it was really staffed by a lot of the doctors from Homer Phillips in St. Louis.
Okay.
It was just, when we got involved, it was like working in St. Louis almost.
Right.
As you know, Homer Phillips was right about at the time of closing, and a lot of those doctors went out there and established practice in the Los Angeles area and was working at the King Hospital.
Okay, and so for people who may not know, Homer Phillips was a hospital that was catered to Black St. Louis residents. And in the 1960s, it was one of the only hospitals where Black medical students could do their residencies. And so, well, I think we should go maybe chronologically, and we'll come back to that point when we get to that point in the story. But I wanted to start with the hospital and with the publication in Ebony in particular, just to reflect for a moment on what makes an architect important. Sometimes it's who the architect studied with. Sometimes there's some obvious artistry in this architect's approach, and sort of a distinctive formal style, for example. But sometimes an architect is important because they are the ones who do the important project. And this is an aspect of Charles Fleming's practice that I hope will come out. And Michael may touch on this as well, sort of what it means that there's a hospital finally in this neighborhood that didn't have one. And also in the projects that Charles Fleming did in St. Louis, they had that analogous role of making institutions, making infrastructure for a Black community that previously did not have it, because the city was segregated and the resources that were available to the Black community were at another level from the majority. So in that respect, there is a way in which Charles Fleming's personal life dovetails with history in the bigger sense, and particularly the civil rights era and the series of moves that were made in the government, for example, that provided more resources, provided entities like HUD for housing and urban development that could then fund projects. And Charles Fleming was someone who, because of the timing of his education, was able to step forward and be the one to do these projects. And so part of the work of the monograph that Eric and I are working on is to reconstruct that trajectory. But it's not just a question of timing. When we're dealing with Charles Fleming, we're also talking about someone who had an extraordinary personal determination to become an architect and had that determination at a young age. So to start at the beginning, or near the beginning, I guess I wanted to ask you to tell us about your early life when you were young, your first experiences with learning about the learning the knowledge that you would then take to your studies of architecture and your early role models. So that's a lot of questions, but I'll remind you.
Well, starting off at a very young age, matter of fact, 5 years old, in kindergarten, I normally kind of tell a story that I was discovered. My first day at school in kindergarten, I commented about the shoes my teacher had on. And I said, oh, those are some beautiful shoes. and I guess what went through her mind, what this little fellow know about shoes and colors and that kind of thing. So she picked up on that, and I was kind of pushed into the areas of art, decorating the room, and Halloween being September, coming into October, Halloween decorations and things like that. And as I progressed through the early grade school years, the other teachers, as I went from class to class, kind of just kept pushing me. And they entered me into some contest painting on storefront windows in Maplewood. Maplewood at that time was our shopping area. Maplewood and Wellston was really like the shopping centers of today. And each year they would have contests at Halloween and Christmas and maybe Easter, and kids would paint on the windows. And I was able to win a lot of contests during that time. So I kind of moved through grade school as an artist, really. And when I arrived in the 5th or 6th, 7th grade, around that time, I had shop classes, they call, or industrial art classes. So I was introduced to the drawing equipment, drawing boards and T-squares and triangles and things like that. And I really enjoyed it, and I liked it. And another thing I might mention, during the summer months at a very young age, I helped my grandfather. He was an interior person. He hung paper and painted. He was a painter. And during those days, we would help him carry scaffolding to Hampton Park and Lake Forest and Ladue area. And he was well known for that type of skill. And during those days, I was able to see, you know, real houses that was not in my neighborhood. And I was interested in that. And another thing I want to mention, my grandfather and other men in the community would, since they had that kind of construction skills, I would work with them during the summer months as a little kid, hanging around various little construction jobs. And they would send me off to the lumberyard. We had a big lumberyard and hardware store in our community, right at Dale and Hanley Road, which is Highway 64 and Hanley Road area right now. And they would send me for nails and things that they would run out of. And even back in those days, 8 or 9 years old, I knew what a 10-penny nail was, you know. So yeah. I was involved in the construction area at a very young age. And that's kind of the way that I, as I remember, making a choice to want to be an architect. Another thing happened after I got married, kind of part of the story related to those shoes. My wife was an educator and she knew my kindergarten teacher. And they had some conversations, which my wife mentioned to me one day, say, oh, I know how you got started in architecture. You were looking at Mrs. Allman's shoes, and I'm not sure about that, but she said they were shoes, but knowing you, you know, she was a very attractive lady. But anyway, it's, that was the beginning and on through high school. And one of the slides you showed that my senior book was, I was listed as wanting to be an architect.
Right.
So,
So even by that time, that was sort of part of your identity.
right. And I was actually designing houses in high school. I was making a few dollars and helping folks in the community at that particular time.
And so when were you involved with the Bennett Avenue district?
This is during the time after I had started, I think I was starting to go to school at Washington University, and even before then, I used to work for Dr. Roussan, who ended up developing this area. And what actually happened, he built a house right in the pathway of Highway 64 and McLeese Station Road, and the house that they had to move it out of the way. And several houses was in the path, and I started moving, helping people move houses by designing the foundations and things like that. And by that time, I was kind of known in the community as that grandfather, Mr. Gaskin, my grandfather, is the guy you ought to go see to help you get your house moved. So the building commissioner at that time was Ed Kelly, who was part of the Vatterott family. He noticed that I was doing a lot of work, and I had to, I wasn't registered, so I had to go and sit down and talk to him to make sure everything was going okay for his foundations and things. And he asked me one day, said, "Why don't you come work for me?" So I started working for Ed Kelly, and by that time, Roussan had started building another new house and developed this Bennett Avenue development, which he was in charge of. So by that time, he had hired Alper Construction Company. And also part of that time with Kelly, just about every house building in Richmond Heights, since he was the building commissioner, he would know about it. And a lot of the builders and developers would come into our office when I was there with him to get plans for their development. So that's how I kind of got started with that Bennett Avenue development there. Mm-hmm. And I guess I was probably in just getting started at Washington University at that time.
At that time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was probably 55, 56, somewhere along in there, 57.
So before we move on into your university years, I just wanted to ask you about something else you said about your neighborhood where you grew up, which was in this very segregated area. That was one of the areas where a lot of the Black residents of the area lived. And you said that your parents both came from Mississippi, as did most of the people you knew. And can you talk a little bit about that neighborhood? And I think you mentioned that there was a brickyard nearby.
Yeah, that was one of the places where a lot of the men in the community worked at, the brickyard. But there was another place, Skull and Steel, and a lot of the men were in various trades in the landscaping business and hauling business. And it was a community where, you know, most of the families were in some kind of business. Even Michael's family was in business. And it was a real close neighborhood. Most of the people, like you mentioned, come in from the South, and bought homes. It was very small homes, but most of them eventually was added on to and redeveloped and that kind of thing. So, Michael, you might talk a little bit about, you know, your experience and how Michael used to live next door to my grandfather. He was a very young, small kid. I used to teach the kids how to play baseball in my area. So I knew Michael, I guess, when he was 8 or 9 years old, or even younger.
Michael, you're muted. Did you want to add something?
There it is. Sorry. I think the thing I wanted to add to Charles's story is that my grandparents were similar. They all lived in Richmond Heights. I remember going out with my grandfather on my father's side in his concrete truck, going out pouring sidewalks and doing really the infrastructure work. Other parts of my family, laid sod. Similar to Charles's story, I remember handing nails to my grandfather on my mother's side, who were building churches in Richmond Heights. So Richmond Heights was, yes, it was a segregated neighborhood, but as you can, but you can see that people in that neighborhood were driven. They had businesses. Everybody worked on Saturdays, whether it was you were whatever grade you were in, you went out to help your relatives get their work done. So yeah, Richmond Heights was a rich experience, I think, all the way around.
Mm-hmm. And another thing I recall, Charles, from the stories that you've told is that people did more than one thing. So your elementary school principal, for example, was someone who moonlighted as a draftsperson. Is that right?
Yeah, A.B. Green was the principal of the Lincoln schools. There was 2 schools. One of them we call the old school and the new school. And he was quite a character. He also refereed all of the high school football games in the conference in St. Louis and Jefferson City and Columbia and different places. And he was also the guy that started little baseball teams and things like that. So he was quite active. He would, the people like my grandfather, if they would run into a complicated job for as some type of stairs or roof design for us connecting something, he was capable. I had the experience to make drawings, and I witnessed that activity, which eventually I was the guy that was called on to do those kinds of things as I grew up in that community.
Right, and I think we can see in your later projects that you continued to be a sort of go-to guy, especially because at some point, once you had gone through Washington University and got your architectural license, then there weren't a lot of other people who had those qualifications, who could bring a level of professionalism to some of these projects that demanded that. So the next, let's say, phase of your biography is sort of that you initially were going to enroll at Hampton Institute, and then briefly there, and then came back to WashU, and while working, enrolled in the University College building design program.
Yeah, back in those days, if you were a good football player or a basketball player, your coach most of the coaches back in those days came from the historical black colleges. And they would call the coach like down at Hampton and said, you know, I have a young man. At that time, Hampton was on the brink of getting their accreditation for architecture. And he told me to, you know, it's kind of like a walk-on system. You go down there and see Coach so-and-so and so and get started. I'm sure you can get in. And that's what I did. It was in the summertime after graduating from high school. And that's how I kind of got involved with Hampton. I was in an accident and I came back to St. Louis and I enrolled at Washington University, getting familiar with Washington University from the Kelly and different architects and people that I knew that was involved when I was moving these houses along Highway 40 there. See, Highway 40 used to stop at Skinker or 64, and it came right straight through Richmond Heights, which today.
So even that neighborhood where Dr. Roussan's house was is now kind of cut, like the street just essentially runs into the wall there.
Right.
So one of my favorite aspects of this part of your biography is the impression you made when you came to Washington University. Tell us about some of the ways that your professors responded. Were they surprised by your abilities, and how you saw yourself in comparison to your fellow students?
Yeah, they were, I guess, you know, they really hadn't seen African-American architects or students in the St. Louis area coming into Washington University. And, you know, I was looked at, matter of fact, one of them came up to me one day. I was sitting there working on some problem early on and said, you know, you should have been a fighter. I just, you know, was all built up from playing football and starting at Washington University. But we ended up, you know, becoming friends, and I really enjoyed myself there. There was a lot of veterans because it was right at the end of the Korean War. And that made a difference because there was a lot of people in my classes that had previous experience or worked in architects' offices. So I had to get up to speed pretty fast. And a lot of guys kind of just wrapped their arms around me and off we went. Just like we mentioned, Worsdale out in San Francisco, a lot of these guys kept up with me and I worked with them all the way through my profession.
Mm-hmm.
People from HOK and Skidmore. And
right. Walter Netz's team. Right. And it's worth noting that Washington University is, again, back to the history of the time, that the corporate firms were just getting started at that time. And the graduates from Washington University were very oriented to practice and to designing real buildings that, you know, got built. And then went on to be sort of these team professionals, and you freelanced with these other firms because you preferred to be on your own. So I wanted to just ask you about the Gateway Bank project, because that one strikes me as one that it's another of these, like the hospital. This was the first African-American owned bank in St. Louis. And it arose because African-Americans were having to make do with their banking services in an environment where banks would not hire African-American tellers. So the decision was made to form a bank, and then you became the architect. I think we might have a picture of the bank here. And we can see that you gave it a very modern look. It was a renovation of an existing union hall, if I recall correctly.
Is this the screen?
It was an existing building that we renovated, and I guess, you know, getting down to the final design decisions that, you know, I tried to make sure that it ended up being a strong, strong design that would be part of the community and part of this whole idea of the Gateway Arch and the expansion of Blacks in the banking business and that kind of thing. And it was the first Black bank in St. Louis. There were some other Black institutes, banks in Kansas City, but Gateway was right, you know, right in line there as being one of the first minority banks at that time.
Yeah.
And
1965 is when it was created. And you had your first office upstairs there, right?
yeah, since I was the architect for the bank, I decided to put an office in there, and that was my introduction to the Black business community in the city, and that's where I got to know a lot of the Blacks in the real estate business and more Black doctors and other business folks in the city. So it was an ideal spot for me to put my office in there. Also, Senator McNeil's office was in the building there. He was one of the first senators, Black senators in the state of Missouri. So it was quite an interesting time during those days.
And some of these people, so the young doctors and the business people, some of them would then be your clients for homes, right. Some of the many houses you designed in the area.
Yeah, the timing was great. You know, that started right at the time that the Black professionals in the St. Louis area was beginning to build homes and move from the little storefront doctor's office to clinics. They were coming up with medical groups and things like that. So it was an interesting time.
Mm-hmm. I'm sensing that Eric would like to ask you a question or two, but I would just like to ask one more before maybe handing it over, or just make another observation, which is that the Gateway Bank building is no longer there. The Gateway Bank I think it failed in the late 20th century and then it was revived, but it's in a new building now. So this building, which was in its time so significant as a symbol of progress, of equity coming to the Black community, has disappeared. And similarly, there's a clinic that you designed, Dr. Hord's clinic in Kinloch, that had a folded roof, you said, that is also no longer there. And I find it fascinating that that we have to then hunt for the traces of these works that were so symbolically important. But I do think that, I mean, I'm looking forward to reconstructing this sort of series of buildings, also to seeing more of the buildings that are still around, such as the St. Phillips Lutheran Church in the Ville. So, Eric?
Yeah, Shantel, just so I want to make sure, can you see the slides now? Is it
Yep.
Yeah, good. Okay, great. Yeah, so, and also we should just emphasize, this is all work in progress. So Charles just shared these old clippings a few days ago. So we're still very much working on the research. And I think that it's important to know there's probably a lot of other works that we haven't seen yet. I know there's a funeral home on Natural Bridge that may still exist. We haven't heard of that yet. I think it's called the Wade Funeral Home, and quite a lot of other projects. But since we don't have too much time, I thought we'd kind of move on into the mid-60s. Charles, you talked about, you were involved a little bit with Laclede Town, and also knew Roger Montgomery, who taught here at WashU and was later dean at Berkeley.
Yeah, doing back in those times, I guess Laclede Town was really the hot spot in St. Louis. It was kind of an integrated community and very alive. It had a couple bars in there, and there was a lot of activity. And also during that time, it was we started getting concerned about Pruitt-Igoe filling and other urban renewal and housing opportunities were coming online. So like guys like Roger Montgomery and Gary Berger and some of the black real estate folks and myself, we all got together and got involved in some of these things that were servicing to try to continue, housing opportunities similar to the Laclede Town project. It was extremely popular then. And as you just mentioned, Shantel, now it's gone. And we have another problem with housing in North St. Louis now. So I guess time, brings about a change, and a lot still needs to be done. I mean, we had 0 now in North St. Louis. The population has dropped tremendously. So maybe some young architects from the community will surface and get involved in this time, like I did. It was a good ride for me.
Well, I wanted to point out that in that picture, I know 3 of those people. There's you. I met Roger Montgomery when I came out to California to Berkeley to teach 1 semester. And Jerry Berger, who was the manager of Laclede Town, and I lived in Laclede Town. So I got a chance to see Jerry more on a daily basis as the Laclede Town manager. As you said, it was a kind of like a brigadoon of artists and musicians and the Black Artist Group and poets and directors and sculptors and just plain people who had a decent place to not only live but form a community. And yes, that's now gone. And Pruitt-Igoe, ooh, I was one of the first residents in Pruitt-Igoe, and that's gone too. So I'm watching out kind of carefully around my neighborhood. I hope I don't bring it down. But I think another point that you made, Charles, about the timing. I think for a certain way of thinking, the timing is always good if you look at it in a particular way. When I came out to California to open your office in '82, there was a recession. But during that recession, it gave me time to talk to everybody because they weren't that busy. I would knock on the door and they said, sure, come in, talk. And so we took advantage of the time that we were in by just reaching out to people. And then when things got busier and busier, I had already started to build our Rolodex from the time when, from that recession. So I don't know, recessions, I think of them as opportunities. And I think that if you're looking for the right thing, or depending on what you're looking for, you can always find an opportunity. When they're tearing down tearing down neighborhoods to build 64 from Highway 40, you were there to move houses, build new neighborhoods. So I think it's just the way you look at the opportunities, especially in the built world, that those opportunities offer you.
Also,
Sorry.
No, go ahead. I thought maybe Charles wanted to talk a little bit about the work with Jenkins Fleming, the Lagos project.
That would be good. And if you could also talk about the time when you were in Lagos during a coup. That's another great story. And one that, that highlights the positive and fun side of things?
You know, really, I got started over in Nigeria through Francine Roussan. She was working for the State Department at that particular time, and I was invited to go to Lagos. And around the same time, George Helmut was in Saudi Arabia, and through some conversations we had, he said, "Why don't we meet up in Lagos?" So we ended up going to Nigeria and spending time there. And when we were there, as you mentioned, it was a coup, so we couldn't get out of the country for, I guess, maybe 2 or 3 weeks. So we had a lot of time to spend in Nigeria, and we got involved in airport work and also the new federal capital city in Abuja. And it was really an experience for me and for George Helmut being there. I mean, it's no doubt from whence we came. That's the first thing. And my wife was with me also when we spent time there in Nigeria. It was quite an experience. And again, that's an indication of the time I was at Washington University and meeting people in the architecture field, and continue to work with them and friends of them, you know, throughout my entire career.
There's a wonderful slide which shows some the Courtney Health Center. Is that the one that Michael saw? Michael, is that the one that you saw? So another story I wanted to touch on is that Michael tells the story of seeing a building and loving it, wanting to become an architect, and then finding out that Charles Fleming had designed it.
In this particular building, I was going. You're right. This was in one of my old neighborhoods. I lived in a lot of neighborhoods in St. Louis, and when I was moving toward architecture and in architecture school, I saw this building, and as you pointed out, I didn't know who designed it. But I said, I want to work for whoever designed that building. And it turned out to be Charles. So, so in 76, after I graduated, I spent the first few months with SRT, Spector, Royce, and Trivers, all WashU people. And then in that same year, I went to work for Charles, and we made a lot of circles connect. There was this building. There was the fact that in Richmond Heights, I lived next to the Gaskins, his grandparents. You know, so we and he knows my parents because, you know, that was the time. If you were Black in St. Louis County, there were only a few places you could go. So whether you were, you know, a steel worker like my father at A.S. Allo, or working as a drafter, an architect, or a judge, or a doctor, you lived in that part of Richmond Heights. So we found all of these connections together, and as a result, I got to work on a lot of very significant projects that I'm happy to say parts and pieces of which are still around, that I worked on, are still around in St. Louis. But what it tells me is that when I did drafting for this, I wasn't on the design side, but I did drafting for this project. But what it tells me is that Charles was willing, and maybe just by personality and his experience, it says he just gave me things to do. He would take a phone number out of his pocket and say, call these people. And I would call them. Or I would get in the car and drive to Springfield to talk to the school district, because we were the architects for the school district, I think that's District 8, Charles, all of East St. Louis. So
Yeah.
I went to Springfield. And it didn't even occur to me to be nervous about it. I said, well, if he thinks I can do it, I'm going. Maybe 24, 26 parks in the city of St. Louis that I was involved with, including Belle Reve on the river, Fountain Park.
And Penrose Park too, right?
Penrose,
So if anybody knows the
Penrose,
velodrome, Charles,
right.
the velodrome.
And the handball court is still there.
Yeah.
So, so what I'm getting at is that he didn't sit me down and say, here's some specific lessons about starting your own firm.
Yeah,
It was
sorry.
just seeing it. It was just being in it
Just
and
threw you in,
calling
sink or
on,
swim. Yeah.
Threw me into the deep to say, go talk to these people, or take the firm with you to California. Really? Okay. So it's the forward motion that I got from Charles was that he was willing to put a lot of responsibilities in my hands. So my confidence, I had a lot of confidence in what that took to make businesses work, because I was just seeing it every day being in the office.
We can see slides here of some of the offices, including one at 400 Olive, where it was on the street level. And I think I've heard both of you tell stories about how people would peer in the windows because they'd never seen anything like this office of architects.
Yeah, they would knock on the conference room window and say, "What do you all do?" They weren't used to seeing, us down there. First of all, and very seldom you would see an architectural firm in St. Louis or in the United States really on the ground floor. I was mentioning to Eric some of my experience in Europe, London, and different places. A lot of the architects were right on, like storefronts, right on the street. And that's kind of the way we were looked at downtown, right at 4th and Olive.
It was a bank, and we kept we kept our drawings in the vault.
Right. We had some drawings.
So there are two questions that have come in from the audience for Charles. One was, did your grandfather live to see your career take off? It's to see your early projects, and if so, what did he think?
Just in the very, very beginning, he passed away, I guess, right after the Korean War, which would have been in the 50s. So he didn't see a lot of the actual things. He knew that I could draw and draft, and I used to be around a lot of the construction projects that he was involved in, and he knew that I was extremely interested. I used to see them. They didn't have a lot of sophisticated tools during that time. And I used to notice they would take 2 tapes and square off a corner of a building to start the footings and foundations. And, today you would have a transit to do those kinds of things for you. And even finding out how to level the floor. They had a way to take a hose with some water in it to get a bubble and a hose. So, and I was curious about those kinds of things, and they were practical and they worked for them. So he knew I was interested, and he used to do a lot of work for, like, on the church and different things, and he would bring in friends of his that were carpenters and people that worked in the construction area from various in our community and outside our community.
Charles, this practical side of how you build reminds me, if you don't have a tool, if you understand the principle, you can make it.
Right.
And when I was working on a project, and I was in school. My summer job was with Levitt and Sons in New York, and I went to a job site, and one of the workers came up to the supervisor and said, "I need a level. I can't. We don't have a level here." And he took a bottle. The supervisor took a bottle, knocked the top of it off, filled it with water, and drew a line around it. And he says, "There's your level." The idea, understanding the principle, and you can make the tools. That story was just, I hadn't thought about that in years, but that story reminded me of people who kept moving forward. They didn't stop and say, "Oh, we have to wait till transits are invented or we get one." You take your rulers and square the building. This was from hand drafting. You learn how to make a square. So this is I think the beauty of all this for me is that it's reminding me of stories and aspects of practice that I was learning from my, carpenter grandfather, from my concrete laying grandfather, from you and Tola, the Hitchens, and all of the people who lived in our neighborhood who were making businesses, and in the face of unbelievable social nonsense. And I'll say one more thing before I have to go. In gratitude to all of you, to you, Charles. The building behind me is Palladio's Basilica in Vicenza, which I had a chance to go see and take pictures of. So that's not a screenshot, that's actual Vicenza. But I remember something you were saying about when we were talking, getting this conversation started about, taking a pause at the term Black architecture. Well, that's not, that's not Black architecture. We were creating architecture. We were creating hospitals and subway stops and subway stations and airports. And I have my own projects all in those arenas. Water infrastructure, it's architecture, it's infrastructure, is how cities work. And I don't think you could drive by. I mean, I was at MARTA. I visited the Jenkins Fleming Atlanta office, the Flemclo Atlanta office, and the Anacostia station in Washington, D.C. And I didn't see a sign on it that said Black architecture. It said Anacostia station or MARTA station or the Comprehensive Health Clinic. So it's not speaking against the pride in being a Black architect. It's really the apotheosis of it. It's how cities work, and you had the opportunity to contribute to it, and thanks to your influence on me, I got my chance too. So thank you in public with 1,177 people watching. I want to say thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Charles, thank you, Michael. Charles, another question someone has asked is, do you have a favorite among all your projects that you're the most proud of, or that you think of as the pinnacle of your practice?
Well, all of my favorites. I guess where I am today, you know, I'm at home. My wife passed away about almost 20 years ago, and I didn't move from St. Louis and moved out. And I guess maybe it's my home because I'm here and I'm constantly repairing things and working on things. This house today is about 50 some years old. So I'm comfortable here, and I have people that stop by and want to buy it and take pictures and that kind of thing. As a matter of fact, this past Halloween, maybe it's been 2 Halloweens, the kids in the neighborhood come by for candy, and one little kid, he said it last year and this year. He said, "Oh, I really like your house. It's real wood." And I guess what he was really trying to say, this house has never been painted, or, you know, I just let it turn natural and kind of blend right into the trees and this particular environment where the house is built. And, you know, it's, I've been able to enjoy it over the years. So maybe this is one of my favorites, but all of them, I mean, I really had an interesting ride working in communities like the health center. They were in trailers before when we started that particular project, and I was running back and forth to Washington, helping them with their planning and their money and so on and so forth. And as Michael mentioned, you know, a lot of our projects were to improve neighborhoods back in those days and even today, but Blacks being involved in their communities and understanding the sensitive things that needs to occur. Another thing I want to mention, a lot of the buildings I designed, I used to pay attention to the materials I used, that it would be minority contractors in the community that could participate in a major part of the projects. So it just kind of goes on and on. You have to be extremely sensitive.
Great. Well, I think, Shantel, I think maybe we were out of time. Is that, yeah, okay. Well, once again, deep thanks to Charles for being willing to do this today. I think it's truly historic to have this now videotaped, and hopefully there'll be more conversations in the future.
Yeah, it's been wonderful. And thanks so much to the audience. If we didn't get to your question and you want to reach out, definitely get in touch with us. And we can...
Is Jack Sanders still on? He had a question early on when we first got started.
Yes, Lauren, did you?
I believe I put the question in the Q&A. I think Jack's question was, it said, recalling our time working together on the Bill Homer G. Phillip project, and by recently reviewing the plan you did for Kinloch, how do you see the potential of redesigning these communities to attract new residents and businesses today?
Well, I think it's a lot of opportunities, you know, with some of the older structures and older neighborhoods, and a lot of interesting things can happen. I remember working with Jack. He was right in the middle of a lot of the things we were trying to do, and some of the neighborhoods throughout the city, DeVille and the North Side, and the public housing developments and all around.
A couple of people have raised hands. If you've done that, could you type your question and we'll try to answer it? Maybe we take 1 or 2 more since they seem to keep coming.
That's where I spent a lot of time today, in the kitchen. Since you can't go to the restaurants, I've become a chef. I can almost, I can cook just about anything a restaurant can put together.
Charles, one person is wondering if you worked with other WashU grads besides the structural engineer, Jay Latham.
I've been on various teams with other architects from Washington University. A lot of them really that have moved in other cities in Washington. Our office in Washington had a baseball team, and all of the different firms, the HOKs and Jacobs and the Lou Cathers, and so you would meet a lot of people, not only in the architecture field, but socially around town. And I stayed in touch with a lot of folks. And this was good because I could get a lot of information from them related to various projects I was involved in. One of the guys in HOK's Washington office worked on the Mount Sano buildings out in Chesterfield that they had going up related to plant life. And at the time, I got the job in Washington to design the botanical gardens for the Congress. I worked with him and related to what he had learned working on that job in St. Louis. One thing I really didn't have any experience about at that time. I didn't know that they sterilized soil in these greenhouses. So this particular greenhouse in Washington for the Congress, that was an important thing that had to happen. And another thing, they had about 40 or 50 different environments in there because a lot of the plant life was given to the United States from Japan and different places. So it was a very interesting project. And again, I got a lot of information from this particular fellow that was running the job in St. Louis for HOK.
Well, I think
Bob
we have
Barr.
to.
I remember, I just thought of his name, a fellow named Bob Barr.
Okay.
Was with HOK.
Speaking of names, someone is wondering if you took a course from Leslie Lasky.
I don't remember the name.
No. I wish.
It seemed like I remember the name, but I don't think so.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of back in those days, he had a bald head, shaved his hair, or maybe didn't have any hair. Maybe that's the same guy. I remember.
Well, I think we have to wrap up the conversation now. I want to say thank you to all the audience members who are sharing little thoughts. Someone said she was born in 1955 in St. Louis, an alum, and is proud of the history. So unfortunately, we aren't all together and can't exchange more, but I hope that maybe we'll have a chance to have another conversation with you so that people can come back and the conversation can continue. And maybe we can continue to find a way to hear from people in the community who have these connections to the school. So thank you. Thank you, Charles, for joining us today.
Well, it's been an interesting time spending with you all this morning. And thanks for being considering me, and maybe we can meet again.
Absolutely.
When this virus goes away.
Yeah, after the pandemic.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Oh, Sabina, any closing comments? Okay. All right.
Thank you Thank you so much. I had a hard time getting on again. So thank you just so much. It was a wonderful conversation. And I really also hope that we can continue this in the future, and hopefully in a social and physical setting again. So thanks so much, Charles. Thanks so much, Chantel, for all the preparation. Thanks so much, Eric. Wonderful program. Thank you.